I want to tell you about the storm first, and about Greyfield, because I think you need to understand the place before the thing that happened in it makes any sense. Greyfield is a small town in eastern Tennessee, tucked between two low ridges in the kind of country where the hills fold over on each other and the roads curve to follow the land instead of cutting through it. I grew up here. I left for Nashville in my late 20s, spent 5 years doing commercial framing, and came back when my father got sick. He passed about 2 years after I returned, and I stayed, the way people who were born in a place sometimes stay when they run out of reasons to leave. I know most everyone in town by name and most of the rest by face, and they know me the same way. The storm came on a Friday evening in early November. The weather service had been tracking it all day, a line of severe thunderstorms with rotation in several cells, and by late afternoon, the sky over Greyfield had gone the color of old iron, and the wind had that particular restlessness that people who grew up in storm country learn to read before they can explain what they are reading. I was finishing a trim job on the east side of town when the emergency alert came through on my phone. I packed my tools and drove. I got about 3 miles from home before the sky opened up. Not regular rain, the kind that comes sideways and drops visibility to nothing in a matter of seconds, the kind that makes the wipers useless and the road in front of you a grey blur. I pulled off instinctively and looked for the nearest building with its lights on. And what I found was the Greyfield Community Church on the corner of Birch Street and Route 9, a white clapboard building that has stood on that corner for over 100 years. I know the church the way I know every building in Greyfield, from the outside and without particular feeling about it. I am not a regular churchgoer. I respect the place without belonging to it. I parked and ran for the front door. Inside, a small crowd had already gathered in the main hall. The church stays unlocked at all hours, one of Pastor Hale's long-standing policies, and people had been pulling in from the road and the surrounding streets for the same reason I had. The combination of bad weather and available shelter working the way it always works in a small town. There were candles lit along the window ledges, and someone had found a battery-powered radio in the church office. And the emergency broadcast was telling us what we could already tell from the sound of the thing outside, which was that we should stay where we were. I knew almost everyone in the room. Pastor Hale was there, soft-spoken and steady in his 60s, moving among the group, making sure people had what they needed. Loretta Hames from the flower shop on Main was there with her teenage son Will, her arm around him and her eyes on the windows. Old Howard Pickett was in the back pew, which is where Howard always sat when he came to services, not saying much to anyone, his hands folded on his knees. The Garners were there, the young couple who had moved to Greyfield about a year ago and taken over the hardware store. June Aldridge, who teaches at the elementary school. Ray Fenwick, who drives the county road maintenance truck, and who I had worked alongside on a drainage project 2 summers back. A handful of others, people I knew well enough to nod to, some well enough to have a real conversation with, all of them from Greyfield or near enough to it that I could account for them. I counted 17. I did not make a production of it. I just did it the way I always do. A quick scan of the room, the number settling in my head the way numbers do when you are practiced at it. 17 people in the church, including me. I noticed it and filed it away. and went back to listening to the radio and watching the windows the same as everyone else. The storm ran for about 2.5 hours. It was the worst I had heard in several years. The windows shook in their frames, and the lights flickered twice before the power went out entirely. And outside the noise of it was a continuous roar that made you raise your voice to be heard by the person next to you. At its worst, sometime around 7 or 8 in the evening, there was a sound like something very large being dragged across the roof of the world, and every person in that room went quiet and still, the way animals go still when they are waiting to find out what is going to happen next. Nothing happened. The roof held. The walls held. The old building did what it had been doing for 100 years, which was stand. The all clear came through the radio just before 9. The roaring had dropped to ordinary rain, heavy but moving, the kind of sound that means the worst is behind you. Pastor Hale went to the front door and opened it and looked out and said the road was passable and the sky was clearing to the west, and that he wanted to thank everyone for keeping calm, and that he hoped everyone would get home safely. People gathered their things. The specific atmosphere of a shared ordeal ending moved through the room. The laughing relief of people who were frightened together and are now on the other side of it, comparing notes and asking about family members and making the sounds human beings make when danger has passed, and they are glad to be the same people they were 2 hours ago. I pulled on my jacket and said goodbye to the people I knew well enough to say goodbye to and moved toward the door. I was one of the last ones out. I was standing on the church steps in the light rain, watching people walk to their cars, when Pastor Hale said something quietly to Ray Fenwick beside him. He said, "That is odd." I asked what was odd. He said he had counted people when they came in, the way he always did when the church was being used as emergency shelter. So he knew how many chairs to put out and whether there was enough water and so on. He said he was fairly certain he had counted 17 when the storm was at its worst. And he was fairly certain no one had come in after that, because he had been near the door for most of the evening. I waited. He watched the last car pull out of the parking lot. He said 18 people just walked out of this church. Ray Fenwick left. He had a wife at home and storm damage to check on, and he said he did not have anything useful to add. And he was right. And he got in his truck and drove away. The pastor went back inside to go over things one more time. I sat on the front steps in the rain and looked at the empty parking lot and thought about the number 17. I had counted it myself. Once, early in the evening, as a habit. I had not counted again at any point during the night because there was no reason to. 17 people in the church, that was the number, and 18 had walked out. The pastor came back to the door, and we went through the list together, carefully, the way you check a count when you think you might have made an error. He named the people he had let in. I confirmed each one. We got to 17. We went through it again. 17. I asked if there was any chance he had miscounted when people came in. He said it was possible. He said he was human and humans made mistakes. He said he would accept that explanation comfortably if he were not fairly certain he had counted twice. I drove home with the windows fogged and the wipers running and the number sitting in my chest like a splinter. I told myself the pastor had miscounted. I told myself That was the reasonable and complete explanation, and I should let it go. I did not let it go. I want to be careful about how I tell this next part, because I am aware of how it sounds when a person says they started asking around about something. I want to be clear that I did not go looking for a mystery. I am not that kind of person. What I did was talk to people the way you talk to people in a small town, at the grocery store and the gas station and the diner on Main Street. And the subject of the storm came up the way it comes up for days after bad weather, in a place where everyone has the same weather. And within those conversations, I asked, when it felt natural, whether anyone had noticed someone in the church that night they did not recognize. I asked Loretta Hames on Monday at the grocery store. She said she had been too focused on Will and too frightened by the storm to pay much attention to the rest of the room, and that was an honest answer, and I believed it. I asked June Aldridge on Tuesday at the gas station. June thought about it. She said she had noticed an older man sitting in the back pew that she did not recognize. She said she had assumed he was a traveler who had pulled in when the storm hit, which happened sometimes on Route 9. She had not thought anything of it. I asked her to describe him. She said older, maybe in his 70s, grey, wearing a dark coat. She said he was very still. She said she remembered noticing how still he was while everyone else was anxious and shifting in their seats, and that she had found it calming at the time without being able to say exactly why. I asked if it was Howard Pickett. She said she knew Howard Pickett, and it was not Howard. I asked if she saw the man leave when the storm ended. She said she was honestly not sure. She thought so. She had been gathering her things and watching the road. She could not say with any certainty whether she had seen him walk out or whether she had simply assumed he went with everyone else. I went to see Howard Pickett on a Wednesday, on the pretext of looking at some storm damage to his porch roof, which was real damage and needed looking at anyway. We did the actual work first, me on a ladder with Howard handing things up, and then we went inside for coffee. I brought up the storm. I said I had heard there was someone in the church that night that nobody could quite place. I asked if Howard had noticed anyone. Howard is 81 years old and has lived in or within 5 miles of Greyfield his entire life. He has a precise and careful way of speaking that I have always respected. The way of a man who does not say things he does not mean and does not mean things he cannot support. He said he had been aware of the man. He said the man was not anyone Howard recognized, which was notable because Howard could account for nearly everyone in the county. I asked if he thought the man was from somewhere else, a traveler. Howard wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and was quiet for a moment. He said the man was familiar in a different way than a neighbor was familiar. He said it was the way a place was familiar, the way the church itself was familiar to Howard after 80 years of walking through its doors. He said the man seemed to belong to the building rather than to the people using it. Then he said he was probably being fanciful and we should have more coffee. I asked if he had seen the man leave when the storm was over. Howard said he had seen the man stand up when the all clear came through, the same as everyone else. He said the man had joined the group moving toward the door. He said that was the last he could fix him in his memory, absorbed into the movement of people heading out, and that try as he might, He could not picture the man in the parking lot, or walking to a car, or moving off down the street. He could picture him in the pew, and he could picture him standing. After that, his memory of the man simply stopped, the way your memory stops on unremarkable details when there is nothing specific to attach them to. Pastor Hale called me on a Friday and asked if I wanted to come by the church on Saturday morning. He said he had been doing some thinking. We sat in the front pew with coffee in paper cups and the morning light coming through the tall windows, and he talked with the honesty of a man who has been a keeper of hard things for a long time. He said the church was old. The current building went up in 1887, but there had been a church on this site before that, going back to the first settlement of the area in the 1820s. He said buildings like this one accumulated history, the way old wood accumulated rings, quietly and without announcement. He said in 30 years at this church, he had heard things from people, not dramatic things, not the kind of stories people tell to frighten each other, but the quieter kind that people bring to their pastor when they do not know where else to put them. He said 2 or 3 times in his time here, people had come to him and said that while alone in the church, they had felt they were not alone. Not in a frightening way, most of them said. More like a presence that belonged there, the way a feeling belongs to a room it has soaked into over a long time. He said he had always taken those accounts seriously without knowing what to do with them. He said he was a man of faith, and his faith made room for the idea that some places held more than others, that some buildings became containers for the lives and sorrows and prayers of all the people who had moved through them over a long time. Then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said he believed the church let someone in during the storm who needed shelter, the same way the rest of them needed shelter. He said he did not think it was there to harm anyone. He said the storm was very bad and the church was open, and something that had been in or near that building for a very long time simply did what it had always done in a bad storm, which was wait it out inside. He said it walked out when the storm was over, because the storm was over. I looked around at the old wooden pews and the worn floor and the winter light coming through the windows, and I asked him if he was sure it was not still here. He said he was fairly sure. He said fairly in the specific way of a man who is being careful to be honest. I went back to the church one more time on a Tuesday evening when the building was quiet and the pastor had gone home for the day. I sat in the back pew, the same place the man had been sitting. It was a cold evening, and the furnace was not running, and I could see my own breath in the air. The building made the sounds old buildings make, the creaks and settling of aged wood responding to the temperature, the particular language of a structure that has been standing long enough to have its own voice. The light through the windows went from late afternoon gold to early dark in stages while I sat there. I want to tell you what I felt because I think it is the most honest part of what I can give you. I did not feel frightened. I had been uncertain about that, had not known what I would feel sitting alone in that cold, empty church after everything I had turned over in the past 2 weeks. But I did not feel frightened. What I felt was something harder to name. The way you feel in a very old building when the oldness of it becomes specific and present, when you stop being a person sitting in a building and start being a person sitting inside a long, accumulated story that was happening before you arrived and will keep happening after you leave. The feeling of being one in a long line of ones, which is either comforting or unsettling depending on where you are in your life when you feel it. I sat until dark, then I went home. I told my friend Dale about it a few weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon with coffee going and the first real cold of winter coming through the windows. Dale and I have been friends since we were 10 years old, which means he has the particular quality of someone who can hear a strange thing from me without needing to immediately put it inside a comfortable box. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if I thought it would happen again. I said I did not know. I said the best I could come to was that whatever it was, it had been in that storm the same way the rest of us were in that storm, looking for shelter from the same weather, in the same building, following the same logic that had driven 17 people through that front door. It had not spoken to anyone. It had not touched anyone. It had not done anything except sit in the back pew while the storm ran, as still as old wood, and then walked out when the walking out was done. Dale asked if I thought it knew it was the 18th, that there were only supposed to be 17. I told him that was the part I could not get any purchase on, whether it had any sense of itself, the way we had a sense of ourselves, whether it knew it was a thing among people rather than a person among people, whether those categories meant anything to it at all. I said I was not sure it mattered. He said, why not? I said, because it did what it did, and came to no harm and caused no harm, and the storm ended and everyone went home. And that seemed like the whole of the thing. I said some things did not need to be understood to be accounted for. You count the people who walked in. You count the people who walked out. You hold the difference between those two numbers somewhere quiet, and you let it be there and you go about your life. He asked what I would do when the next storm came. I said I would probably go to the church again, the same as I would have before any of this, because it was the nearest solid building with its lights on, and that is where you went in bad weather in a small town. I said I might sit in the back pew this time. I said I did not think I would mind the company. About 3 weeks after the storm, I went to Sunday services. I had not been to a regular service in years, and I did not go with any particular plan beyond a feeling that sitting in that space with other people doing an ordinary and human thing might settle something. The whole experience had left unsettled in me. You know the feeling when something has moved through your life and rearranged things slightly, and you need to do something normal in a normal place to get your footing back. The service was unremarkable. Pastor Hale spoke. People sang. The building was warm from the furnace and full of the light that comes through old church windows in the morning, and there was nothing unusual about any of it. I sat in the middle section and let the ordinariness of it work on me, and by the end of it I felt, if not settled exactly, then closer to settled than I had been. When people started filing out and talking in the aisles, I stayed seated for a few minutes. I looked at the back pew. Empty. Of course it was empty. I was not expecting anything, and I did not see anything. I'm not that kind of person, and I know it. But sitting there in the warm Sunday morning church, with the sound of my neighbors' voices around me and the winter light coming through the windows. I had the feeling I sometimes get in very old buildings, the feeling of history being specifically present. Not memory exactly, not a vision, nothing dramatic, just the sense of all the people who had moved through that room over a very long time, leaving something of themselves in the floor and the wood and the air, the way people leave something of themselves in places they have been. I thought about 1887. I thought about the building before that one. I thought about the storms that must have come through Greyfield over 200 years of settlement, and the people who pulled off the road and ran for the nearest door in each of them, and the building that was always there, unlocked and solid, taking them in. And I thought that if something had been sheltering in this building from storms since before anyone alive could remember, then it had been here before every person in this town and would be here long after the last one of us was gone. It had sat through a November storm in the company of 17 people. It had probably been watching come and go for longer than their families had been in the county. And when the storm ended, it had walked out with them, the way you walk out with the people you have been sitting beside when there is no longer any reason to stay. Not because it was one of them, but because the storm was over, and that was what you did when the storm was over. I sat there for another minute. Then I nodded once, to nobody in particular, or maybe to the room itself. And I got up and buttoned my coat and walked out into the cold November morning, where my neighbors were standing in the churchyard talking about the holidays coming up and the condition of the county road and all the small, ordinary things that make up a life in a small place. I stopped on the steps and looked up at the sky. Clear, cold, no weather coming. I went home. This is the part I cannot finish neatly, and I want to be honest about that. I do not know what was in that church. I have turned it over enough times to be comfortable saying that I am not going to arrive at a complete answer, and I have made my peace with that. I know what I counted, and I know what the pastor counted, and I know what June saw, and what Howard said, and none of it adds up to an explanation that closes all the way. What I have is this. 17 people sought shelter at the church during the storm. 18 walked out. I was one of the 17, and I know which one I was, and I have decided that is enough. The ones who need to be concerned about which one they were would know it by now, and nobody in Greyfield has come forward with that concern, which tells me everything I need to know about whether the 18th meant any of us harm. The winter has come on hard this year. There have been 2 more storm warnings since November, both of them turning out to be less than advertised, both of them sending people home early from work and pulling cars off Route 9 and into driveways and parking lots. Both times I watched the church from my truck on the way past, the white clapboard building on the corner of Birch Street, lit up and unlocked the way it always was. Both times the storms were ordinary storms and passed the way ordinary storms pass. But I think about the next bad one, the kind that sounds like the end of something and lasts 2 hours and drives 17 people through a church door. I think about counting heads in a room and coming up one over and the specific weight of holding that number. I think if you are ever driving through eastern Tennessee on a bad night and you see a white clapboard church on a corner with its lights on and its door unlocked, and you pull in because the storm is too bad to drive through and the church is the nearest solid thing. You should go inside. You should find a seat and stay put and wait for the all clear the same as everyone else. But if you are the counting kind, the way I am the counting kind, do yourself a favor. Count when you go in. Count when you walk out. And if the number is different on the way out, I want you to think about what I told you, about a building that has been standing for over 100 years and the storms that have come through in all that time, and the thing that has been sheltering in it longer than any of the rest of us have been here. It did not hurt anyone. It just needed somewhere to wait out the storm, same as the rest of us.